The eviction notice gave me 30 days, but I knew I wouldn't last that long. My savings account showed $847.23, my credit cards were maxed out, and the job market in the city had been brutal for months. At 28, I was facing the possibility of sleeping in my car or moving back in with my parents, neither of which felt like viable options. That's when I remembered Grandpa's old farmhouse, sitting empty in rural Nebraska for the past 15 years. The family had been trying to sell it since 2008, when Grandpa had mysteriously abandoned the property in the middle of the night, leaving behind a successful farm operation and a house full of possessions. The official story was that he'd suffered some kind of mental breakdown. One day, he was a respected member of the farming community. The next, he was gone, leaving only a brief note saying he could never return. The family had tried to maintain the farm for a few years, but without Grandpa's expertise and passion, the operation had failed. Now the property was in tax foreclosure, and the county was looking to sell it for back taxes. The amount owed was exactly $847, every penny I had left in the world. I called the county clerk's office and confirmed that the property was still available. The house sat on 5 acres, enough land for a large garden and maybe some chickens. It wasn't much, but it would give me a roof over my head and time to figure out my next move. The clerk seemed surprised that anyone was interested in the property. "That place has been empty for years," she said. "Are you sure you want to take it on? It's going to need a lot of work." I assured her that I was prepared for the challenge, though truthfully, I had no idea what I was getting into. I just knew that I needed somewhere to live, and this was my only option. The paperwork was processed quickly, and within a week, I was the proud owner of a property that no one else had wanted for over a decade. Chapter 2. The Abandoned Life. I drove out to the farmhouse on a grey October morning, my car loaded with the few possessions I'd managed to salvage from my city apartment. The property was more isolated than I'd remembered from childhood visits. A long gravel driveway led through overgrown fields to a 2-story white farmhouse that had seen better days. The house looked exactly as I remembered it from family gatherings 20 years ago, except for the obvious signs of abandonment. Paint was peeling from the siding, gutters were clogged with debris, and several windows had been boarded up. But the structure appeared sound, and the roof looked intact. What struck me most was how suddenly Grandpa had left. The family had told me he'd taken only a small suitcase, leaving behind everything else he owned. As I walked around the property, I could see evidence of a life interrupted. Farm equipment sitting where it had been parked 15 years ago, a garden hose still connected to the spigot, and laundry hanging on the line that had long since rotted away. I found the key where my aunt had said it would be, hidden under a loose board on the back porch. The lock turned easily, and the door swung open with a creak that echoed through the empty house. The smell hit me first, not the musty odor of abandonment I'd expected, but something else. Something that made my skin crawl and my instincts scream that I should turn around and leave immediately. The interior was a time capsule from 2008. Newspapers were still folded on the kitchen table, dishes sat in the sink, and Grandpa's reading glasses lay on the arm of his favorite chair. It was as if he'd simply vanished in the middle of his daily routine. But there were also signs that his departure hadn't been as calm as the family believed. Furniture was overturned in several rooms, and I could see what looked like scratch marks on the wooden walls near the doors. Something had frightened my grandfather badly enough to make him abandon everything he'd worked for his entire life. Chapter 3. The First Night. I spent my first day cleaning and assessing the house's condition. Most of the utilities had been disconnected years ago, but the wells still provided water, and I managed to get the electricity restored with a call to the power company. The house was structurally sound, though it would need significant work to make it truly comfortable. As evening approached, I began to understand why the property had remained unsold for so long. The isolation was profound. No neighbors within sight, no traffic sounds, just the wind through the overgrown fields and the settling sounds of an old house. I'd brought a sleeping bag and planned to camp in the living room until I could get the bedrooms cleaned up. But as darkness fell, the house began to feel different. The familiar creaks and groans of old wood took on an ominous quality, and I found myself jumping at every sound. Around midnight, I heard what sounded like footsteps in the room above me, slow, deliberate steps that moved from one end of the ceiling to the other, then stopped. I lay still, listening, but the sound didn't repeat. I told myself it was just the house settling, or maybe mice in the walls. Old houses made all kinds of noises, especially when they'd been empty for years, but the footsteps had sounded too heavy and too regular to be anything other than human. I grabbed a flashlight and went upstairs to investigate. The second floor consisted of 3 bedrooms and a bathroom, all empty except for dust and cobwebs. I checked each room carefully, looking for any sign of intrusion, but found nothing unusual. As I turned to go back downstairs, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. In the dust on the floor of the master bedroom, there were footprints. Fresh footprints that hadn't been there when I'd checked the room earlier that day. The prints were large, made by work boots, and they led from the window to the door and back again, as if someone had been pacing back and forth. But the window was locked from the inside, and there was no other way into the room. I spent the rest of the night sitting in my car, wondering what I'd gotten myself into. Chapter 4. Grandpa's Hidden Messages. The next morning, I returned to the house determined to find a rational explanation for what I'd experienced. In daylight, the footprints in the dust looked less defined, and I began to convince myself that I'd imagined their clarity in the darkness. I decided to start going through Grandpa's belongings, looking for clues about why he'd left so suddenly. The house was filled with the accumulated possessions of a long life. Books, photographs, farm records, and personal mementos that painted a picture of a man who had been deeply rooted in this place. But as I searched more carefully, I began finding things that didn't fit the image of a simple farmer. Hidden behind books on the shelves were journals filled with strange symbols and what appeared to be research notes about local history. Tucked into picture frames were newspaper clippings about unexplained disappearances and unusual phenomena in the area. The most disturbing discovery was a series of letters Grandpa had written but never sent, all addressed to various family members. The letters spoke of watchers in the fields, voices in the walls, and things that shouldn't exist but do. One letter addressed to my father was particularly chilling. "I know you'll think I've lost my mind, but I'm not crazy. There's something on this land that doesn't want us here. It's been patient for generations, but it's getting stronger. I can feel it watching me, waiting for the right moment to act." Another letter described specific incidents, tools that moved by themselves, animals that behaved strangely, and shadows that appeared where no shadows should be. Grandpa had documented everything with the methodical precision of a scientist, but his conclusions were anything but scientific. "It feeds on fear and isolation," he'd written. "The more alone you are, the stronger it becomes. That's why it drove away the neighbors, why it made sure this place became isolated. It's been preparing for something, and I think that something is happening now." The final letter was dated the day before Grandpa disappeared. "I can't fight it anymore. It's in the house now, in the walls, in the very air I breathe. I have to leave before it's too late, before it takes me like it took the others." Chapter 5. The research Grandpa's references to others who had been taken sent me to the local library to research the history of the property and the surrounding area. What I found in the newspaper archives and historical records was deeply unsettling. The farmhouse had been built in 1923 by my great-great-grandfather, but it wasn't the first structure on the land. According to county records, there had been 3 previous homesteads on the same site, all abandoned under mysterious circumstances. The first family, the Hendersons, had disappeared entirely in 1887. Their house was found empty, with meals still on the table and no sign of struggle. The second family, the Kowalskis, had lasted only 2 years before fleeing in 1903, claiming the land was cursed by evil spirits. The third family, the Murphys, had built a larger house in 1915, but they too had abandoned it after reporting strange phenomena, unexplained sounds, moving objects, and what they described as malevolent presences that made life unbearable. My great-great-grandfather had bought the land cheap because of its reputation, dismissing the previous owner's claims as superstition. He'd torn down the Murphy house and built the current farmhouse, apparently believing that a fresh start would solve whatever problems had plagued the property. For several decades, the Thompson family had prospered on the land, but I found records of periodic incidents that suggested the problems had never really gone away. Family members had occasionally reported strange experiences, but these had been dismissed as imagination or explained away as natural phenomena. The pattern seemed to intensify every few generations. My great-grandfather had experienced some kind of crisis in the 1940s that had caused him to consider selling the property. My grandfather's father had gone through a similar period in the 1970s, becoming increasingly paranoid and reclusive before his death. Now it was Grandpa's turn, and he had chosen to flee rather than fight whatever force was affecting the property. The question was whether I would be strong enough to succeed where 3 generations of my family had failed. Chapter 6. The Watchers. Armed with Grandpa's journals and my own growing sense of unease, I began to notice things I'd missed during my first few days in the house. There were indeed watchers in the fields, dark shapes that appeared at the edge of my vision, but vanished when I looked directly at them. At first I assumed they were animals, deer perhaps, or large birds that were naturally wary of human presence. But the shapes moved wrong, with a fluidity that didn't match any wildlife I knew, and they seemed to be observing me with an intelligence that was distinctly unsettling. The phenomena weren't limited to the outdoors. Inside the house, I began experiencing the same strange occurrences that Grandpa had documented. Objects would be in different places than where I'd left them. Doors that I'd closed would be found standing open, and there were sounds. Footsteps, whispers, and what sounded like breathing in empty rooms. The most disturbing incidents involved what Grandpa had called the voices in the walls. Late at night, I would hear what sounded like conversations coming from inside the house's structure. Multiple voices speaking in low tones, discussing things I couldn't quite make out. I tried recording these sounds with my phone, but the recordings always came out as static or silence. Whatever was causing the phenomena seemed to be aware of my attempts to document it and actively resisted being captured. The psychological pressure was intense. I found myself constantly on edge, jumping at every sound and shadow. Sleep became difficult, and when I did manage to rest, I was plagued by vivid nightmares about dark figures surrounding the house. I began to understand why Grandpa had described the entity as feeding on fear and isolation. The more frightened I became, the more active the phenomena seemed to grow. It was as if my terror was providing energy for whatever force was at work on the property. But I also began to notice patterns in Grandpa's research that suggested there might be ways to fight back. He'd found references to protective rituals and symbols that had been used by previous inhabitants to ward off malevolent influences. Chapter 7. The Protection Rituals. Grandpa's research had led him to study the folklore and protective practices of various cultures that had dealt with similar phenomena. Hidden throughout the house, I found evidence that he'd attempted to implement some of these protective measures. Salt lines had been poured across doorways and windowsills, though most had been disturbed over the years. Iron objects, horseshoes, nails, and old farm tools had been placed at strategic locations around the property, and carved into the wooden frames of doors and windows were symbols that Grandpa had copied from various sources. His journals contained detailed instructions for these protective rituals, along with notes about their effectiveness. Some measures seemed to work better than others, and Grandpa had been constantly experimenting with different combinations and techniques. The most promising approach seemed to involve what he called spiritual grounding, establishing a strong connection to the positive history and energy of the land while actively rejecting the malevolent influence that was trying to take control. The entity feeds on fear, but it's weakened by confidence and purpose, Grandpa had written. It wants us to feel like victims, like we have no power over our own lives, but this is our land, our home. We have every right to be here, and we don't have to accept its dominance. I decided to try implementing some of Grandpa's protective measures, starting with the most basic ones. I renewed the salt lines, repositioned the iron objects, and spent time each day walking the property boundaries while consciously asserting my right to be there. The effects were subtle but noticeable. The watchers in the fields seemed to retreat further from the house, and the indoor phenomena became less frequent and less intense. I was still experiencing strange occurrences, but they no longer felt as threatening or overwhelming. More importantly, I was beginning to feel like I had some control over the situation. Instead of being a helpless victim of supernatural harassment, I was actively fighting back against whatever force was trying to drive me away. But Grandpa's journals also contained warnings about the entity's ability to adapt and escalate its attacks when its initial tactics failed. Chapter 8. The Escalation. As my protective measures began to show results, the phenomena shifted and intensified in ways that Grandpa's journals had predicted. The entity seemed to realize that its usual tactics weren't working and began trying more aggressive approaches. The voices in the walls became louder and more distinct, often calling my name or making threats about what would happen if I didn't leave. Objects didn't just move, they were thrown with enough force to cause damage, and the watchers in the fields began approaching closer to the house, sometimes visible in broad daylight. The most terrifying incident occurred on my 10th night in the house. I was awakened by the sound of someone walking around downstairs, moving through the rooms with heavy, deliberate steps. But when I crept to the top of the stairs to investigate, I could see that the rooms below were empty. The footsteps continued for over an hour, accompanied by the sounds of doors opening and closing, furniture being moved, and what sounded like someone searching through drawers and cabinets. But every time I worked up the courage to go downstairs, the sounds would stop, and I would find everything exactly as I'd left it. The psychological warfare was taking its toll. I was sleeping poorly, eating irregularly, and finding it difficult to concentrate on anything other than the constant sense of being watched and threatened. I began to understand how the entity had worn down previous inhabitants until they had no choice but to flee. But I also found strength in Grandpa's research and the protective measures that were clearly having some effect. The entity was escalating its attacks because its usual methods weren't working. That suggested I was on the right track, even if the process was becoming more difficult. Grandpa's final journal entries described a similar escalation period before his departure. But he'd also discovered something that he believed might be the key to permanently resolving the situation, something he'd been too frightened to attempt but had documented for whoever might come after him. The solution involved confronting the entity directly and demanding that it leave, but only after completing a specific ritual that would provide protection during the confrontation. Chapter 9. The Confrontation Ritual. Grandpa's instructions for the confrontation ritual were detailed and precise, drawn from multiple sources and refined through his own experimentation. The ritual required specific timing, materials, and mental preparation that would take several days to complete properly. The first step involved creating a protective circle in the center of the house's main room, using salt, iron filings, and symbols carved into the wooden floor. The circle had to be perfect, with no breaks or irregularities that might allow the entity to penetrate the protection. The second step required gathering personal items that connected me to the positive history of the property. Family photographs, tools that had been used for productive work, and objects that represented the legitimate human presence on the land. The third step was the most challenging. I had to spend 3 days fasting and meditating within the protective circle, building up the mental and spiritual strength necessary to face the entity without being overwhelmed by fear. During this preparation period, the phenomena around the house reached a fever pitch. The entity seemed to sense what I was planning and was doing everything possible to disrupt the ritual. Windows shattered, doors slammed with tremendous force, and the voices in the walls became a constant cacophony of threats and curses. But the protective circle held, and I found that my fear was gradually being replaced by determination and anger. This was my family's land, my inheritance, and I had every right to live here in peace. Whatever this entity was, it had no legitimate claim to the property and no right to terrorize the people who belonged here. On the third night of preparation, as I sat in the center of the protective circle, surrounded by the chaos of the entity's rage, I felt ready to make the confrontation that Grandpa had been too frightened to attempt. The ritual called for me to step outside the protective circle at midnight and directly challenge the entity, demanding that it leave the property and never return. The success of the confrontation would depend on my ability to maintain confidence and authority in the face of whatever the entity might do to try to break my resolve. Chapter 10. The Face of Fear. At exactly midnight, I stepped outside the protective circle and called out to the entity that had been tormenting my family for generations. My voice echoed through the house as I demanded that it show itself and explain its presence on our land. The response was immediate and terrifying. The temperature in the room dropped dramatically, and a darkness deeper than the absence of light began to gather in the corners. The darkness moved with purpose, flowing across the walls and ceiling like living shadow until it coalesced into a shape that was almost human but fundamentally wrong. The entity was tall and thin, with features that seemed to shift and blur when I tried to focus on them. Its eyes were the worst part, ancient, malevolent, and filled with a hunger that had nothing to do with physical needs. This was something that fed on human suffering and had been doing so for far longer than my family had owned this land. When it spoke, its voice came from everywhere and nowhere, a whisper that seemed to originate inside my own head. "You cannot make me leave. I was here before your kind walked this earth, and I will be here when the last of you is dust. This land is mine by right of age and power." But Grandpa's research had prepared me for this moment. I stood my ground and replied with the words he'd written for this confrontation. "You have no right here. This land belongs to the living, to those who work it and care for it. You are a parasite, feeding on fear and bringing nothing but destruction. I command you to leave and never return." The entity's response was a wave of pure terror that crashed over me like a physical force. I saw visions of everyone who had fled this land before me, broken and defeated by the same overwhelming fear I was experiencing now. I saw what it wanted to do to me, to drive me mad with terror until I became another source of the suffering it craved. But I also saw something else in those visions, the entity's weakness. It was powerful, but its power came entirely from the fear it generated. Without that fear, it was nothing more than an echo of something that had died long ago. Chapter 11. The Banishment. Drawing on every ounce of courage and determination I possessed, I pushed back against the entity's assault of terror. Instead of allowing myself to be overwhelmed by fear, I focused on anger. Anger at what this thing had done to my family, anger at the generations of suffering it had caused, and anger at its presumption that it could drive me from my own home. "You have no power over me," I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. "You are nothing but a shadow, a remnant of something that should have died centuries ago. This land rejects you, this house rejects you, and I reject you." The entity's form began to waver and lose cohesion as I continued the banishment ritual. I could feel its desperation as it realized that its usual tactics weren't working, that I wasn't going to break and flee like the others before me. It made one final attempt to destroy my resolve, showing me visions of what it claimed would happen if I stayed. Madness, death, and the destruction of everyone I cared about. but these threats only strengthened my determination to see the ritual through to completion. Following Grandpa's instructions, I began the final phase of the banishment, speaking words of power that he'd gathered from multiple sources and traditions. The words felt strange on my tongue, but they carried weight and authority that the entity couldn't ignore. By the right of blood and inheritance, by the power of the living over the dead, by the authority of those who build rather than destroy, I banish you from this place. You are forbidden to return, forbidden to influence, forbidden to harm. Go back to whatever darkness spawned you and trouble the living no more. The entity's scream of rage and defeat shook the entire house, rattling windows and causing the protective circle to flare with brilliant light. Then, suddenly, it was gone. The oppressive presence that had haunted the property for generations simply vanished, leaving behind only the normal sounds and sensations of an old farmhouse on a quiet night. I stood in the center of the room, exhausted but victorious, knowing that I had succeeded where others had failed. The land was finally free. Chapter 12. The Aftermath. In the days following the banishment, the transformation of the property was remarkable. The oppressive atmosphere that had hung over the land for generations was gone, replaced by a sense of peace and normalcy that I'd never experienced there before. The watchers in the fields disappeared completely, and the strange phenomena inside the house ceased entirely. For the first time since arriving, I was able to sleep through the night without being awakened by unexplained sounds or sensations. More importantly, the land itself seemed to be healing. Plants that had struggled to grow in the contaminated soil began to flourish, and wildlife returned to areas that had been barren for years. It was as if the entity's presence had been poisoning the very earth, and its removal had allowed natural life to return. I spent the following weeks cleaning and repairing the house, finally able to work without the constant sense of being watched and threatened. As I went through Grandpa's remaining possessions, I found a final letter that he'd apparently written after completing his research, but before his departure. "If you're reading this," the letter said, "it means you succeeded where I failed. I'm proud of you for having the courage to face what I couldn't. The land is yours now, truly yours, free from the shadow that has haunted our family for so long." The letter went on to explain that Grandpa had discovered the banishment ritual but had been too frightened to attempt it. He'd hoped that someone else in the family would eventually inherit the property and have the strength to complete what he'd started. "I know I disappointed everyone by leaving," he wrote, "but I couldn't risk the entity using me to hurt the people I loved. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is admit that you're not strong enough for a particular fight and leave it for someone who is." I understood now why Grandpa had abandoned everything so suddenly. He hadn't suffered a mental breakdown. He'd made a calculated decision to protect his family from something he couldn't defeat. His research and preparation had made my victory possible, even if he hadn't been able to achieve it himself. Chapter 13. The New Beginning. 6 months after the banishment, the farmhouse has become the home I'd always dreamed of having. The repairs are complete, the utilities are fully restored, and I've started a small organic farming operation on the 5 acres that came with the property. The land is incredibly fertile now that it's free from the entity's influence, and my crops are thriving beyond anything I'd expected. Local farmers have commented on the remarkable transformation of soil that had been considered marginal for decades. I've also started a small business restoring old farmhouses for other families, using the skills I developed while renovating Grandpa's place. The work is satisfying and profitable, allowing me to maintain the property while building a sustainable future. Most importantly, I've reconnected with my family's agricultural heritage in a way that would have been impossible in the city. I understand now why Grandpa loved this land so much, and why he was willing to fight for it, even when that fight seemed hopeless. The house is filled with life again. Friends visit regularly, and I'm dating a wonderful woman who shares my love of rural living and sustainable agriculture. The isolation that once made the property vulnerable to supernatural influence has become a source of peace and tranquility. I've kept Grandpa's journals and research materials, both as a record of what happened here and as a resource in case similar situations arise elsewhere. I've learned that properties with histories like ours aren't uncommon, and that the knowledge Grandpa accumulated could be valuable to other families facing similar challenges. The farmhouse that I bought with my last $847 has given me far more than just a place to live. It's provided me with a purpose, a connection to my heritage, and the satisfaction of knowing that I was able to complete something that previous generations had started but couldn't finish. Every morning when I walk through the fields that are now truly mine, I think about Grandpa and the courage it took for him to research and document the entity's weaknesses, even knowing he might not be strong enough to use that knowledge himself. His sacrifice made my victory possible, and his legacy lives on in the peaceful, productive land that he helped to free. The abandoned farmhouse has become a symbol of renewal and redemption, proof that even the most haunted places can be reclaimed by those with the courage to face their fears and fight for what's right.